The blood on the snow was her own, though Zelda Foster didn't realize it at first through the fog of starvation that clouded her mind. She stumbled forward another few steps, her worn boots barely lifting from the frozen ground as the wind howled around her like a living thing. January 1883 had brought the worst blizzard Colorado had seen in a decade, and Granite was just a blur of yellow lamplight in the distance, so close yet impossibly far. Her fingers had gone numb hours ago, her thin coat doing nothing against the brutal cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. The world tilted sideways, and she fell hard into a snowdrift just beyond the last buildings of town, her body finally giving up the fight it had been waging for 3 days without food. She didn't hear the horse approaching, didn't feel the strong arms that lifted her from the snow as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. Consciousness flickered like a candle in the wind, and in those brief moments of awareness, she saw a man's face above her, weathered and strong, his dark eyes filled with concern beneath the brim of his hat. Then everything went black again. The warmth hit her first when she finally clawed her way back to awareness. Not the gentle warmth of a distant fire, but real heat that seemed to wrap around her like a blanket. She was lying on something soft, and there were voices nearby, low and urgent. Her eyelids felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds, but she forced them open to find herself staring at rough wooden beams across a ceiling. The smell of coffee and something cooking made her stomach clench painfully. "Easy now," a deep voice said, and suddenly that face from before was there again, closer this time. The man had thick dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and those eyes that seemed to see right through her. He couldn't have been more than 26 or 27, she guessed, though the lines around his eyes spoke of a hard life. "You're safe. You're in my house just outside Granite. I'm Jackson Foster." "Foster," she whispered, her voice barely working. "That's my name too." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Well, that's a coincidence. Though I've got to say I've never seen you around here before, and I know most of the families in these parts." "Different Fosters," she managed, then tried to sit up. The room spun violently, and she would have fallen if his hand hadn't steadied her shoulder, pressing her gently back down onto what she now realized was a cot near a large cast iron stove. "Don't try to move yet. When did you last eat?" His voice was firm but kind, the kind of voice that was used to being obeyed but didn't need to shout to make it happen. Zelda had to think about it, her mind still foggy. 3 days, maybe 4, I lost track. Jackson's jaw tightened and he stood abruptly. "Jesus, all right, stay put. I'm making you some broth. If you eat too much too fast after that long, it'll make you sick." She watched him move around what she could now see was a surprisingly tidy kitchen. The house was small but well built, the kind of place that spoke of a man who took pride in his home. There was a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and through an open doorway she could glimpse another room with a bed and wardrobe. Everything was clean and organized, which seemed at odds with her expectations of a bachelor cowboy living alone. "Why did you help me?" she asked quietly. "You don't know me." Jackson glanced over his shoulder as he ladled something from a pot on the stove into a bowl. "Because you needed help. Isn't that reason enough?" He brought the bowl over and helped her sit up more carefully this time, propping a folded blanket behind her back. "Besides, what kind of man would I be if I left someone to freeze in the snow?" The broth was warm and savory, and Zelda had to force herself to sip it slowly despite her body's screaming demand to gulp it down. Jackson sat in one of the wooden chairs he'd pulled over, watching her with an expression that was part concern and part curiosity. "Where were you heading?" he asked after a moment. "Granite isn't exactly on the way to anywhere." It wasn't supposed to be granite, Zelda said between careful sips. I was trying to get to Denver. I had a job lined up there, working as a seamstress for a dress shop. But the stage broke an axle 2 days out, and the driver said we'd have to wait for repairs. Then the storm came, and she trailed off, not wanting to relive the chaos that had followed. The other passengers who had abandoned the stage to seek shelter in different directions. The driver who had stayed with the coach. Her own desperate decision to walk toward what she thought was the nearest town. You walked from where the stage broke down. Jackson's voice held disbelief. That's got to be 15 miles in good weather, let alone in a blizzard. I didn't have a choice, she said simply. I spent my last money on that stage ticket. There was nothing to go back to. Something in Jackson's expression softened. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Where are you from originally? Kansas. Topeka. The memories pressed against her throat, but she forced herself to continue. My parents died last summer. Cholera. I couldn't keep up the payments on their shop, and I couldn't stay in a town where every corner reminded me of them. So I sold everything and bought that ticket to start over. I'm sorry, Jackson said, and the sincerity in his voice made her eyes burn with tears she refused to shed. That's a hard thing to bear. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the crackling of the fire in the stove and the wind still howling outside. Zelda finished the broth and felt a small measure of strength returning to her limbs, though exhaustion still pulled at her like an anchor. You can stay here tonight, Jackson said, standing and taking the empty bowl. The storm's not letting up, and you're in no condition to go anywhere anyway. I'll sleep in the barn with the horses. I can't ask you to do that, Zelda protested, though even as she said it, she knew she had no other options. You're not asking. I'm offering. He moved back to the stove and began cleaning the bowl. In the morning, we'll figure out what comes next. But for now, you need rest and warmth and more food when your stomach can handle it. Zelda wanted to argue, wanted to maintain some shred of dignity and independence, but her body had other ideas. Her eyelids were already drooping again, and the cot was so warm and soft compared to the frozen ground she'd been walking on for days. Thank you, she whispered. Jackson paused in his work and looked at her. In the lamplight, his features seemed softer somehow, less weathered. Get some sleep. You're safe here. She was asleep before he even put on his coat to head out to the barn. When Zelda woke again, pale winter sunlight was filtering through the window, and the storm had finally quieted to occasional gusts of wind. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache, but the desperate weakness had receded. She sat up slowly, testing her strength, and found she could stand without the world spinning. Someone had left a pile of clothes on the chair next to the cot, clearly meant for her. They were men's clothes, far too large, but they were clean and would be warmer than her own travel-stained dress. She changed quickly, rolling up the sleeves and pant legs, and was just trying to figure out the suspenders when the door opened, and Jackson came in with an armload of firewood. He stopped short when he saw her standing, then a slow smile spread across his face. Well, you've got more color in your cheeks than you did yesterday. That's a good sign. He moved to stack the wood near the stove. How do you feel? Like I was trampled by a horse and left for dead, Zelda admitted, but better than yesterday. Progress. Jackson began building up the fire again. I've got bacon and eggs if you think you can handle it, and coffee, always coffee. The smell of the bacon sizzling in the pan was almost enough to make Zelda weep with gratitude. She sat at the table and watched Jackson cook, with the easy confidence of a man who'd been doing it for himself for a long time. He moved efficiently around the small kitchen, never wasting a motion, and she found herself noticing details she'd been too weak to see the night before. The way his shoulders filled out his shirt, the strength in his hands as he cracked eggs into the pan, the small scar that ran along his left jawline. "So," she said, needing to break the silence that was becoming too comfortable, "what does a cowboy do when there's 3 feet of snow on the ground?" Jackson chuckled. "Same thing he does any other time. Animals don't care about the weather, they still need feeding and tending. I've got a small herd of cattle and a few horses. Nothing fancy, but it's mine." He plated the food and brought it over, setting a portion in front of her that was generous but not overwhelming. "Eat slow." The food was simple but perfectly cooked, and Zelda forced herself to take small bites even though her body wanted to devour everything in sight. Jackson sat across from her with his own plate, and they ate in a surprisingly easy silence. "What will you do?" he asked after a while. "Denver's still there, I'm guessing, but the stage won't run again until the road's clear. Could be a week or more." Zelda had been trying not to think about that. "I don't know, the job won't wait forever, and I can't impose on your hospitality indefinitely." "It's not an imposition," Jackson said firmly, "but I understand the position you're in." He took a sip of his coffee, studying her over the rim of the cup. "Can you really sew? You said you were going to work in a dress shop." "I can sew anything," Zelda said with more confidence than she felt about anything else in her life right now. "My mother taught me. We made everything from everyday clothes to wedding dresses in our shop." Jackson nodded slowly, something thoughtful crossing his face. "There's a woman in town, Mrs. Patterson. She runs the general store with her husband. She's been complaining for months about needing someone who can do alterations and repairs. Might not be as fancy as a Denver dress shop, but it would be work." Hope flickered in Zelda's chest, fragile but real. "Do you think she'd consider me? I don't have references or anything with me. Everything was in my trunk on the stage." "I'll vouch for you," Jackson said simply, "and once she sees your work, that'll speak for itself." "Why would you do that?" Zelda asked, not understanding this stranger who kept offering her kindness without asking for anything in return. "You don't know anything about me except that I'm foolish enough to walk through a blizzard." Jackson's expression grew serious. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly. 2 years ago, I was in a bad way. Lost my job on a big ranch because I stood up for a Mexican hand who was being treated poorly. Couldn't find work anywhere because word spread that I was a troublemaker. I was sleeping rough, running out of money, and winter was coming on." He paused, remembering. "An old rancher named Thomas Wheeler found me trying to fix his fence for free, hoping he'd notice and offer me work. Instead of running me off, he gave me a job, helped me save up enough to buy this land and start my own place. He died last spring, but I promised him I'd pay forward the kindness he showed me." The story hit Zelda harder than she expected. She'd spent so long feeling alone in her struggles that she'd forgotten there were good people in the world who helped simply because it was right. "I'll work hard," she promised. "However I can repay you, I will." "Just get back on your feet," Jackson said. "That'll be enough." Over the next 3 days, Zelda regained her strength while the snow continued to fall intermittently and the wind piled drifts against the sides of buildings. Jackson insisted she stay in the house while he slept in the barn, despite her repeated protests. She tried to make herself useful, cooking meals and tidying what was already a tidy house, and in the evenings, they would sit by the stove and talk. She learned that Jackson was 27, that he'd been born in Missouri but came west when he was 18 looking for adventure and freedom. He'd worked on various ranches throughout Colorado and Wyoming before settling in Granite. He loved his horses more than most people, had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh, and read books whenever he could get his hands on them, which surprised her. "What?" he asked when she commented on the small shelf of books in the corner. "You think cowboys can't read?" I think most cowboys I've heard about aren't interested in Shakespeare and Mark Twain, she replied, examining the worn spines. Well, most cowboys haven't met me. There was a teasing light in his eyes that made her heart do something strange in her chest. Jackson learned that Zelda was 23, that she could recite poetry from memory because her mother used to quiz her while they sewed, that she was terrified of thunder but not of much else, and that she had a sharp wit that matched his own. He found himself looking forward to the evenings when the work was done, and they could sit together, her face illuminated by the lamplight, her voice filling the empty spaces in his house that he hadn't realized were so silent before. On the fourth day, the storm finally broke, leaving the world buried in white but the sky clear and painfully blue. Jackson hitched up his wagon and drove Zelda into Granite, the horses struggling through the deep snow but making steady progress. The town was small, maybe 200 people if you counted everyone in the surrounding area, with a main street lined with false-fronted buildings that had seen better days. But it was alive and bustling despite the cold, people digging out from the storm and going about their business. The general store was warm and crowded when they entered, the bell above the door jingling. A stout woman with gray hair and kind eyes looked up from behind the counter and broke into a smile when she saw Jackson. "Jackson Foster, as I live and breathe. I was worried about you out there during the storm." Her eyes shifted to Zelda with open curiosity. "And who's this, Mrs. Patterson? This is Zelda Foster. No relation." Jackson put a hand on Zelda's back, gently urging her forward. "She's a seamstress looking for work, and I remembered you mentioning you needed someone." Mrs. Patterson's eyes sharpened with interest, looking Zelda up and down with the assessing gaze of a businesswoman. "Is that so? What's your experience, dear?" Zelda straightened her spine and met the woman's gaze directly. She explained about her parents' shop, the kinds of work she'd done, the skills she'd learned. Mrs. Patterson listened intently, asking occasional questions that showed she knew the trade. "I'll tell you what," the older woman finally said. "I've got a pile of mending in the back that's been waiting for months. You do that, and we'll see about something more permanent. I can pay you by the piece and provide room and board. There's a small room above the store that's empty." It wasn't the Denver dress shop, but it was work, and it was here in this little town where Jackson lived. Zelda ignored that last thought and nodded. "I'll do my best. Can't ask for more than that." Mrs. Patterson came around the counter. "Let me show you the room." Jackson waited downstairs while the two women went up the narrow staircase. The room was small and plain, with a single bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street. It was cold now, but Mrs. Patterson assured her there was a small stove that heated it well enough. "It's perfect," Zelda said honestly. After sleeping on the ground and then on Jackson's cot, having a room of her own seemed like luxury. They went back downstairs where Jackson was examining a display of rope with the intensity of someone trying to look occupied. He looked up when they appeared, and something in his expression seemed almost disappointed when Mrs. Patterson announced that Zelda would be staying there. "That's good," he said, his voice steady. "That's real good." "I'll need to get my things from your place," Zelda said, though the truth was she had almost nothing. The carpet bag that had been all she could carry from the stage was still sitting by the cot in Jackson's kitchen. "I'll bring them by tomorrow," Jackson offered. "Give you time to settle in." There was an awkward moment where neither of them seemed to know what to say. Mrs. Patterson was watching them with knowing eyes, a small smile playing at her lips. "Well," Jackson finally said, "I should get back cattle to feed." He nodded to Mrs. Patterson. "Madam." Then to Zelda, his gaze holding hers for a long moment. "Miss Foster, good luck with the work." Thank you, Zelda said, meaning it for so much more than just the introduction to Mrs. Patterson. For everything. He touched the brim of his hat and left, the bell jingling behind him. Zelda watched through the window as he climbed into the wagon and drove away and felt an unexpected hollowness in her chest. That man's sweet on you, Mrs. Patterson said matter-of-factly. And if I'm not mistaken, you feel the same. Zelda jerked her attention back to the older woman, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. I barely know him. He just helped me when I needed it. Hum. Mrs. Patterson's smile widened. Well, come on then. Let me show you that mending. And you can tell me all about how you barely know Jackson Foster while we work. The pile of mending turned out to be more of a mountain. Everything from torn work shirts to ladies' dresses that needed hemming. Zelda set to work immediately, grateful for something to occupy her hands and her mind. Mrs. Patterson was easy to talk to, with a warm manner that put Zelda at ease, and before long, she found herself telling the whole story. The loss of her parents, the failed attempt to reach Denver, waking up in Jackson's house. He gave up his own bed for me, Zelda said, carefully stitching a torn seam in a pair of trousers. Slept in the barn in the middle of winter. What kind of man does that? The kind you should hold on to, Mrs. Patterson replied, working on her own tasks at the counter. Good men are rare as hen's teeth out here, dear. Most of them are either spoken for or they're the kind you don't want. Jackson Foster is one of the good ones. Over the following weeks, Zelda settled into a routine. She would wake early, have breakfast with Mr. and Mrs. Patterson in their living quarters behind the store, then work on the mending and alterations until evening. Word spread quickly that there was a seamstress in town, and soon she was getting custom orders for new dresses and shirts. The work was steady and satisfying, and the Pattersons treated her like family. Jackson came to town every few days for supplies, and he always stopped by the store. At first, their conversations were brief and polite, but gradually they grew longer. He would find excuses to linger, examining merchandise he didn't need, and she would find reasons to come out from the back room where she worked. They talked about everything and nothing, their words less important than the simple fact of being near each other. It was Mrs. Patterson who finally took matters into her own hands. On a Saturday in late February, she shooed Zelda out of the workroom. You've been cooped up for weeks, the older woman declared. It's a beautiful day, relatively speaking, and you need fresh air. Go for a walk. But I have 3 dresses to finish, Zelda protested, and they'll still be here when you get back. Go on now. Mrs. Patterson was already pushing her toward the door. In fact, I saw Jackson Foster heading into the saloon a few minutes ago. Probably picking up supplies from the storeroom in back where they keep the feed. You might run into him. Zelda gave her a look that said she knew exactly what the woman was doing, but Mrs. Patterson just smiled innocently and shut the door behind her. The air was cold, but the sun was shining, and after being inside for so long, it did feel good to walk. Zelda pulled her shawl tighter and started down the boardwalk, nodding to the people she'd come to know over the past weeks. She was just passing the saloon when Jackson emerged, carrying a sack over his shoulder. He nearly ran into her and had to stop short. "Miss Foster," he said, genuine pleasure lighting his face. "This is a surprise." "Mrs. Patterson threw me out," Zelda admitted. "She said I needed air." Jackson's grin was knowing. "She's a subtle one, isn't she?" They stood there for a moment, people moving past them on the busy street, until Jackson shifted the sack and said, "I'm just loading this in the wagon. Would you walk with me?" They walked together to where his wagon was parked at the end of the street. Jackson loaded the sack into the back, then turned to her, suddenly seeming nervous in a way she'd never seen him before. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, taking off his hat and turning it in his hands. There's a dance next Saturday. The town has them once a month in the church hall. Would you allow me to escort you?" Zelda's heart jumped. It wasn't a surprise exactly. They'd been circling around this thing between them for weeks now, but hearing him actually ask made it real. "I'd like that very much." His smile was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "Good, that's good." He put his hat back on. "I'll come by the store around 7. I'll be ready." They stood there grinning at each other like fools, until someone drove past in another wagon, and Jackson had to step closer to her to get out of the way. Suddenly they were nearly touching, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell the scent of leather and horses and winter air that clung to him. Her breath caught in her throat. "I should get back," she whispered, not moving. "Yeah," Jackson agreed, not moving either. Finally, Zelda forced herself to step back. "Thank you for asking me to the dance. Thank you for saying yes." His voice was warm, intimate. "I'll see you Saturday." She walked back to the store in a daze, barely noticing the cold. Mrs. Patterson took one look at her face when she came in and laughed. "Well, I'd say that walk did you some good." The week until the dance seemed to drag and fly by at the same time. Zelda found herself distracted from her work, staring into space with a smile on her face until Mrs. Patterson would clear her throat pointedly. She decided to make herself a new dress for the occasion, working on it in the evenings in her room. It was nothing fancy, just a simple design in a deep green fabric that she'd bought from the store's stock. But it was the first thing she'd made for herself since leaving Kansas, and she poured all her nervous excitement into every stitch. Saturday arrived with clear skies and temperatures that felt almost warm compared to January's brutal cold. Zelda spent the afternoon getting ready, pressing the dress carefully, arranging her dark blonde hair in a style that was more elaborate than her usual simple bun. When she looked at herself in the small mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her cheeks were flushed with anticipation, her blue eyes bright. She looked alive in a way she hadn't since before her parents died. Jackson arrived exactly at 7, dressed in what were clearly his best clothes. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, and when he saw her descending the stairs from her room, he stopped breathing for a moment. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice rough with sincerity. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she replied, taking the arm he offered. The church hall was already crowded when they arrived, filled with most of the town's residents all dressed in their finest. A small group of musicians was setting up in the corner, tuning their fiddles and guitars. Long tables along one wall held food and drinks that the townswomen had contributed, and the air was filled with laughter and conversation. People greeted Jackson warmly, and they greeted Zelda with curiosity and friendliness. She'd met many of them through her work at the store, and it felt good to be part of this community, to belong somewhere again after months of feeling adrift. When the music started, Jackson led her onto the floor for a waltz. His hand was warm at her waist, her own hand clasped in his other one, and they moved together with surprising ease. He was a good dancer, confident in his movements, and she found herself laughing as he spun her around. "Where did a cowboy learn to dance like this?" she asked. "My mother insisted," he admitted. "Said a man should know how to conduct himself at a proper social gathering, even if he spent most of his time with cattle." They danced several more dances, pausing only to catch their breath and get some punch. Other men asked Zelda to dance, and Jackson danced with other women, but they always found their way back to each other. It was during a slower dance, as the evening was winding down, that Jackson pulled her a little closer and said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Her heart stuttered. "What is it?" "I care about you, Zelda." More than I probably should, given we've only known each other a few weeks. But from the moment I found you in that snow, something in my life shifted. Having you in my house, talking with you, getting to know you, it all felt right in a way nothing else ever has. He paused, swallowing hard. I know you had plans for Denver, and I don't want to stand in the way of that if it's what you really want, but I needed you to know how I feel. Zelda's eyes stung with sudden tears. She stopped dancing, forcing him to stop too, right there in the middle of the floor. Other couples moved around them, but she didn't care. I care about you too, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I've been trying not to, trying to tell myself it was just gratitude for you saving my life. But it's more than that. When I'm with you, I feel like I'm home for the first time since my parents died, and that terrifies me. Why does it terrify you? Because what if I'm wrong? What if this is just about both of us being lonely? What if we're rushing into something that will fall apart? The fears she'd been holding back came tumbling out. I lost everything once already. I don't think I could survive losing everything again. Jackson's hands tightened on hers. I can't promise that nothing bad will ever happen. Life's too unpredictable for that. But I can promise that I'm not going anywhere. Whatever this is between us, I want to see where it goes, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure you never feel lost again. Around them, people were starting to notice that they'd stopped dancing and were standing in the middle of the floor having an intense conversation. Zelda became aware of the attention and felt her cheeks heat. "Can we go somewhere and talk?" she asked. Jackson nodded and led her off the floor, out through the side door into the cold night air. They walked a little way from the hall, their breath forming clouds in the darkness. The music was muffled now, and the stars overhead were brilliant in the clear sky. "I don't want to go to Denver," Zelda said suddenly. "I thought I did, but that was when I had no other options, when I was running away from grief instead of running toward something. Here, I have work I enjoy. I have the Pattersons who have been kinder to me than I deserved, and I have you." She turned to face him fully. "I want to stay, Jackson, if you'll have me." His answer was to pull her into his arms and kiss her, and the world narrowed down to just the two of them, the warmth of his lips on hers, the strength of his embrace. Zelda had been kissed before, a few awkward attempts by boys in Topeka who had courted her briefly, but nothing had ever felt like this. This felt like coming alive. This felt like choosing life instead of just surviving it. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I'll have you for as long as you'll stay." "That might be a very long time," she warned. "I'm counting on it." They went back inside to knowing smiles and a few poorly concealed whispers, but Zelda didn't care. She danced with Jackson for the rest of the evening, and when he drove her back to the store in his wagon, she kissed him goodnight under the stars before going inside, feeling like her heart might burst from happiness. The courtship that followed was the talk of granite for weeks. Jackson came to town more often, always finding excuses to stop by the store. Sometimes he would take Zelda for rides in his wagon on Sunday afternoons, showing her the surrounding countryside as spring slowly began to melt the winter snow. They would talk for hours about their dreams, their pasts, their hopes for the future. He told her about wanting to expand his ranch someday, about the horses he hoped to raise. She told him about wanting to open her own dress shop eventually, about the designs she sketched in her spare time. In early April, Jackson invited her out to his place for dinner. Zelda rode out with him after work on a Saturday, and was struck by how much the landscape had changed since that terrible day in January. The snow was mostly gone except in the shadiest spots, and green was starting to show through the brown grass. Jackson's house looked different too in the spring light, more welcoming somehow. He'd clearly put effort into preparing the meal. And while the roast was a bit overdone and the potatoes slightly underdone, Zelda thought it was the best dinner she'd ever had because of the care he'd taken. After they ate, they sat outside on the small porch he'd built, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I want to ask you something," Jackson said, his voice serious. "And you can say no if it's too soon. I'll understand." Zelda's heart began to race. "Ask me." He stood and pulled her to her feet, then took both her hands in his. "Zelda Foster, I know we've only been courting for 2 months. I know by all rights I should wait longer, do this properly. But I've never been more sure of anything in my life than I am of this, of us. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The tears that had been threatening all evening finally spilled over. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, absolutely yes." Jackson whooped and spun her around, and when he set her down, he kissed her with a passion that left them both dizzy. "I don't have a ring yet," he admitted, "but I'll get you one, I promise, the best one I can afford." "I don't need a ring," Zelda said, though she was touched by the thought. "I just need you." They were married 6 weeks later in the same church where they danced. Mrs. Patterson cried through the whole ceremony, and Mr. Patterson gave Zelda away since she had no family of her own. Nearly the whole town turned out for the wedding, genuinely happy to see 2 people they'd grown fond of finding happiness together. Zelda wore a dress she'd made herself, white with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, and Jackson wore a new suit that Zelda had tailored to fit him perfectly. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Jackson kissed her in front of God and everyone, Zelda felt a peace settle over her that she'd thought she'd never feel again. She'd lost so much, but she'd found something too. She'd found home. They moved her few possessions from the room above the store to Jackson's house, which was now their house. Zelda continued her seamstress work, but now she did it from home, converting the small second room into a proper workroom. Women would come out from town for fittings, and she would deliver finished pieces when Jackson went in for supplies. It was a good arrangement that allowed her to work and still be available for the endless tasks of running a ranch. Because running a ranch, Zelda quickly learned, was far more work than she'd ever imagined. There were always animals to tend, fences to mend, gardens to plant. Jackson taught her to ride properly, and though she was nervous at first, she soon came to love the feeling of galloping across the open land with the wind in her hair. They worked side by side through the long spring days and into summer, building something together that was more than just a marriage. They were building a partnership, a life. Their first real test came in July when a band of cattle rustlers hit several ranches in the area. Jackson lost 10 head of cattle, which was a significant loss for a small operation like his. Zelda found him in the barn that evening, his face drawn with worry. "We'll recover," she said firmly, putting her arms around him from behind. "It's a setback, but we'll recover." "Those cattle represented 6 months of income," Jackson said, his voice tight. "I was going to use that money to buy more land to expand. Then we'll expand slower. We'll find another way." She turned him to face her. "You told me once that we'd get through whatever came. That works both ways. We're in this together." Jackson pulled her close, holding her tight. "I don't deserve you." "Yes, you do, and I deserve you. Now come inside. I made stew and it's getting cold." They did recover, though it took longer than either of them hoped. Zelda took on extra sewing work, and Jackson hired himself out for day labor at larger ranches when his own work allowed. It was hard, but they never complained, never blamed each other for their struggles. If anything, the hardship brought them closer together. By autumn, they were back on solid footing and the crisis had passed. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching the leaves turn gold, Zelda placed Jackson's hand on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly. "Come spring." Jackson's face went through several emotions at once: shock, joy, fear, and fierce protectiveness. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He kissed her with such tenderness that she felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. "A baby, our baby. Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Jackson said, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Terrified, but happy." The winter that followed was mild compared to the previous year, for which they were both grateful. Zelda's belly grew round, and Jackson became increasingly protective, barely letting her lift anything heavier than a teacup. She found it both endearing and slightly annoying, though she understood it came from love. In early April, on a warm spring day with the windows open to let in fresh air, Zelda went into labor. Mrs. Patterson came out to help, along with another woman from town who delivered many babies. Jackson was banished to the porch, where he paced for hours while trying not to imagine all the things that could go wrong. When he finally heard a baby's cry, he nearly broke down the door getting inside. Zelda was pale and exhausted, her hair plastered to her head with sweat, but she was smiling. And in her arms was the most beautiful thing Jackson had ever seen, a tiny red-faced baby boy squalling with impressive lungs. "We have a son," Zelda said, her voice tired but full of wonder. "We have a son, Jackson." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and reached out to touch the baby's impossibly small hand. Tiny fingers wrapped around his much larger one, and Jackson felt his heart expand in a way he didn't know was possible. What should we name him? They'd discussed names before, but now, looking at this little person they'd created together, Zelda knew exactly what felt right. "James, after your father." Jackson's father had died when he was young, and he'd rarely spoken of him, but Zelda knew the man had been important to him. Jackson looked at her with so much love that she thought her heart might stop. "James Foster. That's perfect." Being parents was harder than anything either of them had done before. James was colicky for the first few months, crying for hours at a time while they took turns walking him and trying everything they could think of to soothe him. They were exhausted and overwhelmed, and sometimes Zelda would cry along with the baby, feeling like she was failing. But Jackson was there always, supporting her and sharing the burden. He would hold James for hours so Zelda could sleep, would clean and cook and do whatever needed doing. And slowly, as the baby grew and the colic passed, they found their rhythm. James became a happy, curious baby who smiled easily and seemed fascinated by everything around him. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Josephine, born 2 years after James, and another son, Jacob, 3 years after that. The ranch grew slowly but steadily. Jackson added more land, increased his herd, and built a reputation for breeding quality horses. Zelda's sewing business expanded too, and she eventually trained 2 young women from town to help her, operating what had become the closest thing to a proper dress shop in the area. There were hard times too. A drought one year that killed half their cattle. A winter when Jacob got sick with pneumonia and they nearly lost him. A fire in the barn that destroyed 6 months' worth of hay. But through it all, they had each other, and that made everything bearable. On their 10th anniversary, Jackson surprised Zelda with a trip just for the 2 of them, leaving the children with the Pattersons for a few days. He took her to Denver, the city she'd been trying to reach when he found her in the snow all those years ago. They walked the busy streets hand in hand, marveling at how much bigger and more modern it was than Granite. They ate in fancy restaurants, saw a play, shopped in stores that sold goods from all over the world. It was exciting and overwhelming, and after 2 days, Zelda was ready to go home. "Do you ever regret it?" Jackson asked on the train ride back. "Not getting here when you planned, not working in that dress shop." Zelda thought about it seriously. "No," she finally said. "That was a different life, one I thought I wanted because I didn't know any better. The life we built together is better than anything I could have imagined, better than anything I could have found here. Even when the barn burned down, even when money was so tight we ate nothing but beans for 2 months, even then." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Because we went through those things together. You're my partner, Jackson, in every sense of the word. We built something real and solid and ours. No fancy dress shop could ever compare to that." He kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Zelda Foster. I love you too." They picked up their children and went home to the ranch, to the life they'd created through love and hard work and sheer determination. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new reasons to be grateful. James grew tall and strong like his father, taking to ranch work naturally. Josephine had her mother's skill with a needle and her father's head for business, a combination that served her well. Jacob was the dreamer of the family, always with his nose in a book, fascinated by the changing world around them. As Zelda and Jackson grew older, they watched with pride as their children became adults and started making their own ways in the world. James took over much of the ranch work, eventually bringing home a wife of his own. Josephine opened her own shop in Denver, though she came home often. Jacob went east to study, though he always said Granite was home. One evening, when they were both in their 50s, Zelda and Jackson sat on the porch they'd rebuilt and expanded over the years, watching the sunset just as they had on that night when he'd proposed. Her hair was streaked with gray now, and his was mostly silver, but they still held hands like young sweethearts. "You remember the first time I sat on this porch?" Zelda asked. "I remember every moment of that day," Jackson said. "I remember being terrified you'd say no when I asked you to marry me. I remember thinking I was crazy for proposing so soon. We were crazy. 2 months of courtship before getting engaged. It was absurd." She laughed softly. "But it was also the smartest thing I ever did, saying yes to you." "I found you in the snow," Jackson said thoughtfully, "half dead from hunger and cold, and somehow in saving your life you saved mine too. I didn't even know I needed saving until you were there." "We saved each other," Zelda corrected. "That's what love does, I think. It saves us from being alone, from facing everything by ourselves. It makes us better and stronger than we could ever be on our own." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the day fade into night, the stars beginning to appear one by one. The ranch was quiet around them, the cattle settled, the horses in the barn. Inside the house, they could hear James and his wife getting their young children ready for bed, the next generation already growing up in the home Jackson had built and Zelda had turned into a true home. "No regrets?" Jackson asked, echoing the question he'd asked years before in Denver. "Not a single one," Zelda replied. "Though I do sometimes wonder what that woman in the snow would think if she could see us now, if she could see everything we built from that one desperate moment." "I think she'd be proud," Jackson said. "I think she'd be amazed at how strong she turned out to be." "And what about the man who stopped to help a stranger? What would he think?" Jackson considered. "I think he'd be grateful, grateful that he listened to the better angels of his nature that day. Grateful that he didn't ride on past, grateful for every single moment that came after." Zelda squeezed his hand. "You know what the best part is? We still have more moments ahead of us, more sunsets on this porch, more grandchildren to spoil, more years of this life we built together." "That," Jackson agreed, pulling her close, "is the best part indeed." They stayed there until the stars filled the sky and the night air grew cold, reluctant to leave the peace of the moment. Finally, they went inside to the warm house filled with family and love, closing the door on another day in a life full of them. Each one a gift, each one a reminder that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best things, and that love, real love, is worth whatever it takes to find it and keep it. Years continued to pass, and as Jackson and Zelda moved into their 60s and then 70s, they slowed down but never stopped. They handed over more of the ranch operations to James, but they still woke early and still did what they could. Zelda's hands grew arthritic, making sewing difficult, but she taught her granddaughters the skills her mother had taught her, passing down the knowledge through generations. On a spring morning in 1918, 35 years after Jackson had found Zelda in the snow, they sat together on their porch one last time. Jackson had been feeling poorly for a few weeks, though he'd tried to hide it from everyone. Zelda knew, though. After so many years together, she always knew. "I'm tired," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I know," she said, tears already forming though she tried to hold them back. "I don't want to leave you. I know that too." She held his hand, feeling how thin and fragile it had become, though in her mind he was still the strong young man who'd carried her through the snow. "But Jackson, we've had such a good life, such a full life. 3 beautiful children, grandchildren, this ranch, each other. How many people can say they had that much? Not enough of them," he said. He turned his head to look at her, his eyes still clear and full of love despite his failing body. "You made me so happy, Zelda, every single day. And you made me feel safe and loved and home," she replied. "You gave me a reason to live when I'd lost everything. You gave me a family and a purpose and a love story that people in town still talk about." He smiled faintly. "They do tell it well. The desperate woman in the snow and the cowboy who saved her. You did save me. And I'd do it all again, everything, just to have these years with you." Jackson squeezed her hand one more time. "I love you, Zelda Foster. I love you too, Jackson Foster, forever." He closed his eyes then, still holding her hand, and as the sun rose higher over the ranch they'd built together, he quietly slipped away. Zelda sat with him for a long time, crying but also feeling grateful for every moment they'd been given, every challenge they'd faced, every joy they'd celebrated together. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Colorado. Jackson had become a respected figure in the area, known for his fairness, his hard work, and the love story that had become legend. But for Zelda, it was the loss of her partner, her best friend, the other half of her heart. She lived for 5 more years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, still sharp and engaged with the world even as her body grew frailer. She never stopped missing Jackson, but she never regretted their life together. How could she, when it had been so full and so good? On a cold January morning in 1923, exactly 40 years after Jackson had found her in the snow outside Granite, Zelda passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her children buried her next to Jackson on a hill overlooking the ranch, their graves side by side, just as they'd lived side by side for more than 3 decades. The ranch stayed in the family for generations after, and the story of Jackson and Zelda became one of those tales that gets told and retold, changing slightly with each telling, but keeping its essential truth. The desperate young woman who collapsed in the snow. The cowboy who carried her to his kitchen and saved her life. The love that grew from that chance encounter into something that sustained them through decades of hardship and joy, proving that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings. Their great-grandchildren would eventually stand at those graves, reading the simple headstones, and understand that real love, the kind that lasts, isn't about grand gestures or easy times. It's about choosing each other every day, about building something together brick by brick, about being there when things get hard and celebrating together when things go right. It's about a man who stopped to help a stranger, and a woman brave enough to accept that help and everything that came after. The house eventually fell into disrepair after the family sold the ranch in the 1970s, but the story lived on, passed down through generations not just of Fosters, but of anyone who had ever heard it and been moved by it. Because it was more than just a love story. It was a testament to human kindness, to the power of choosing hope over despair, to the way that one moment of compassion can ripple out across decades and touch countless lives. And if you went to Granite even now, though it's barely more than a few buildings and a historical marker, and asked the old-timers about Jackson and Zelda Foster, they'd smile and tell you about the winter of 1883, about the blizzard and the girl in the snow and the cowboy who wouldn't ride past someone in need. They'd tell you about the wedding that the whole town attended, about the ranch they built, about the children and grandchildren who carried on their legacy. They'd tell you about a love that started with an act of mercy and grew into something that defined what it meant to build a life with someone, through good times and bad, until death parted them at last, but couldn't touch what they'd created together. Because some love stories, the real ones, don't end when the people in them die. They live on in the lives they touched, the family they created, and the simple truth they proved. That love, real lasting love, is always worth whatever it costs to find it and nurture it and protect it. And that sometimes, the best things in life come from the moments when we choose to help a stranger in need.